My husband, Julian, had just been promoted to top salesperson of the year at his father's company. He loved that title. The way it rolled off his tongue, the way people looked at him with admiration, it was everything he had ever wanted. To celebrate, his father hosted a grand dinner at the Silverstone Grill, a place where deals were made over wine, and reputations were built on laughter. The restaurant glowed under soft amber lights, and the air buzzed with conversation. Julian was in his element, confident, charming, perfectly composed. He wore his navy suit like armor and his arrogance like perfume. Every joke he made drew smiles. Every glance from him felt like validation to the people sitting around the table. I sat quietly beside him, a polite smile on my face, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I had spent years learning the difference between love and admiration, and tonight, he reminded me which one he valued more. As the waiter refilled his glass, Julian stood up and raised it high. "To the team that made this possible," he said, looking around proudly. And to my wife, everyone turned their eyes toward me, expecting something sweet, something worthy of a toast. But he wasn't done. He smirked, pausing just long enough for effect. Maybe she should take notes from a real professional. The first chuckles spread like ripples in water. Then laughter broke loose, loud, careless, cruel. Richard slapped the table so hard that the cutlery clattered. Chelsea from HR hid her grin behind her napkin. Even Marcus, who once nearly lost his job because of Julian's mistake, joined in. Laughter filled the room, warm for them but cold for me. Julian's eyes sparkled with pride. He wasn't laughing at a joke, he was laughing at the power he held in that moment, the power to make everyone laugh with him, even if it meant laughing at me. "My biggest achievement," he continued, grinning. "Getting her to fold laundry on time." The laughter roared again, echoing off the walls. Then, with a playful smirk, he added, "She married me for money." I watched their faces, glowing with amusement. To them, it was harmless humor. To me, it was years of patience being tested. But I didn't flinch. I smiled, slow, calm, practiced. I lifted my glass slightly and said softly, "Relax, dear. Jokes are fun." The laughter died mid-echo. He blinked, unsure if I was still playing along or calling him out. But I didn't explain. I didn't have to. That was the first moment the room realized, silence can be louder than humiliation. And F.O. The next morning, Julian woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. He yawned, stretched, and looked at me with the same easy confidence he always had after getting his way. Last night's laughter had clearly done wonders for his ego. For him, it was just another dinner, another stage where he played the charming winner. I, on the other hand, had barely slept. Not because his words had hurt me, but because they had clarified something I had been ignoring for far too long. There comes a moment when you stop being angry at someone who underestimates you, and start preparing to show them who you really are. Julian poured himself a cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone. His company emails flooded in, congratulatory messages, a few invitations, and one from his father reminding him about the quarterly reports. He smirked. "You know," he said casually, "Dad wants me to handle more of the company now. Guess he finally realized who the real backbone is." He laughed softly, expecting me to respond. I didn't. Instead, I stood by the window, watching the rain trace tiny rivers down the glass. "Julian," I said quietly, "do you ever wonder how much you actually own of the company you work for?" He frowned slightly, confused. "What kind of question is that?" I turned toward him, my voice calm, almost curious. "Because when you say your company, it sounds like you've forgotten something important." He laughed again, brushing me off. "Sweetheart, you wouldn't understand these things. Business isn't really your area. That one line, dismissive, practiced, habitual, sealed his fate. Because what he didn't know, what he never cared to know, was that the documents sitting quietly in my study said something different. While Julian had spent his years perfecting charm and manipulation, I had been building something real. When his father first needed funding to expand operations, I was the one who provided the capital, under a silent partnership. Over time, through careful restructuring, share acquisitions, and board agreements, I became the majority shareholder of the same company Julian bragged about running. He never asked where the extra money came from, never questioned why the board trusted my suggestions. To him, I was just the quiet wife who folded laundry and attended dinners. But to the company, I was the invisible hand behind its stability. I watched him take another sip of coffee, still scrolling, still unaware. There's a kind of poetic satisfaction in letting someone dig their own grave, not out of cruelty, but out of balance. As he left for work, his reflection in the glass merged with mine. Two people sharing one life, one living for applause, the other for peace. He kissed my forehead and said, "Don't wait up for me tonight." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I won't." And for the first time, my words weren't just polite, they were a promise. Julian walked into the office that morning like a man who owned the world. He greeted the receptionist with a wink, waved at his team, and strutted toward his corner office, the one with the panoramic view that made him feel important. Every step he took echoed confidence, but if you listened closely, there was a faint sound beneath it, the quiet cracking of the foundation he didn't know was slipping. Meetings filled his day. He loved talking numbers, even if he didn't always understand them. He was fluent in confidence, not competence. That afternoon, the board gathered to discuss expansion plans, and as usual, he dominated the conversation. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've got ideas that will take us to the next level. My father trusts me completely." But the CFO cleared his throat, hesitant. "Actually, Mr. Julian, there's been a change." Julian frowned. "A change?" The CFO exchanged a glance with another board member. "Ownership. There's a new majority shareholder." For a brief second, Julian laughed, assuming it was a joke. Then he noticed the folder being slid toward him. The company seal. The signatures. The legal stamp. 56% ownership, transferred under a name he knew all too well. Mine. The laughter from the night before echoed in his head, the same laughter that once made him feel powerful now turned into something haunting. His grip tightened on the folder. This must be a mistake," he stammered. The CFO shook his head. "No mistake, sir. The paperwork was finalized months ago. You might want to speak with the owner directly." He stormed out of the room, the sound of his expensive shoes hitting the marble floor like thunder. He called me immediately. But I didn't answer. At home, I sat in my office, the same space where I'd quietly built everything he took for granted. My phone buzzed again and again. I let it ring. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost beautiful. By evening, his father called. "Did you know about this?" Julian asked, voice trembling. His father sighed. "She kept your company alive, son. When you were busy celebrating yourself, she was protecting your legacy." Julian didn't respond. For the first time in years, he had no words. When he finally came home that night, his arrogance was replaced with disbelief. He stood at the door, staring at me like I was someone else. Maybe, for the first time, he was seeing me clearly. I looked up from my papers, calm as ever. "Long day?" I asked softly. He hesitated. You own the company?" I smiled faintly. "No, Julian. I am the company." He sank into the chair opposite me, his hands trembling as he realized every cruel joke, every careless word, had been directed at the woman who had the power to end his career. And I hadn't even raised my voice yet. For 2 days, Julian avoided me. He left early, came home late, and filled the silence with excuses. The laughter that once echoed through our house was gone, replaced by the heavy sound of realization. He had built his image on control, and now that control belonged to me. Friday evening, his father arranged another dinner, same restaurant, same table, but a completely different atmosphere. This time, it wasn't about celebration. It was about accountability. When we entered Silverstone Grill again, Julian walked beside me quietly. Gone was the man who loved to dominate a room. He smiled politely at the staff, but his eyes were somewhere else, probably on the invisible weight sitting on his shoulders. The board members were already there. Richard, Chelsea, Marcus. All the faces that once laughed at me now looked nervous, uncertain which side to stand on. The waiter poured wine, and I caught Julian glancing at me, the same glance he once used to silence me. Now it was filled with questions he was too afraid to ask. Halfway through dinner, his father cleared his throat. "Julian," he said calmly, "I think you owe your wife an apology." The room froze. Julian blinked. "Dad, his father cut him off. "She's the reason this company still exists. She didn't take credit, didn't boast, she just worked silently while you mocked her." Every eye turned to me. I stayed silent for a few moments, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, slowly, I placed an envelope on the table, neatly sealed, with the company's insignia printed on top. Julian stared at it. "What is that?" "Closure," I said softly. "And clarity." He reached for it hesitantly, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, his official termination letter, effective immediately, signed by the new chairwoman of the board. Me. The sound of paper rustling was the only thing that dared to move in that silence. He looked up, disbelief flooding his eyes. "You're firing me?" I smiled faintly. "I'm not firing you, Julian. I'm freeing you from the illusion you built." Chelsea's fork clinked softly against her plate. Richard looked down, pretending to read his menu. Marcus simply whispered, "Wow." Julian sat there, speechless. For once, the man who always had something to say, had nothing left to defend. I leaned forward, my tone calm, almost gentle. "Do you remember what you said that night? About my biggest achievement being folding laundry?" He swallowed hard, saying nothing. "Well," I continued, "turns out my biggest achievement was teaching a man who thought he owned everything, how quickly it can all disappear." I stood up, adjusted my coat, and looked around the table one last time. Then, turning to Julian, I said the same words that had started it all, "Relax, dear. Jokes are fun." But this time, nobody laughed. Julian didn't return to the office after that night. He tried to, once, but walking through those doors felt different now. The whispers, the glances, the quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer untouchable, it all echoed louder than applause ever had. He spent weeks in silence, trying to understand how the woman he had underestimated had been silently writing the story of his downfall. But there wasn't much to understand. The truth was simple: he had mistaken her grace for weakness, her quietness for submission, and her love for permission. Meanwhile, the company changed. Under my leadership, the atmosphere shifted from arrogance to accountability. I started new programs: equal pay, mentorship for women, transparent policies. The board meetings no longer revolved around ego, but purpose. For the first time, it felt like the company had a soul. People noticed the difference. The same employees who once laughed at Julian's jokes now spoke to me with respect, not fear. even his father, once blinded by pride, quietly thanked me for saving what he had built. He didn't need to say much. Sometimes silence carries more gratitude than words ever could. As for Julian, we didn't speak for a long time. One afternoon, months later, he came to return a few papers I'd asked for. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. His voice had lost its sharpness. "Violet," he said softly, "I'm sorry." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the man I had once fallen in love with, not the one who mocked me. But time changes everything. Some wounds heal, and others simply teach you where not to stand again. "I know," I said. "I just hope you've learned the same thing I did." He nodded slightly. "And what's that?" I smiled faintly. "That silence isn't surrender. It's strategy." He left quietly after that. No grand goodbye. No last word. Just the sound of footsteps fading down the hall, the sound of a man finally understanding that power doesn't come from control, but from composure. That night, as I sat by the window, I thought about how strange it is that the world notices women only when they raise their voice, and forgets the kind of strength it takes to stay silent until the right moment. I lifted my glass, not in victory, but in peace. Because this wasn't revenge. It was revelation, and maybe that's what empowerment truly is, not about breaking someone down, but reminding them who you were all along. This story of silent power and calculated grace moved you. Take a moment, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Was it when Violet calmly said, "Relax, dear. Jokes are fun," or when she slid that envelope across the dinner table, watching arrogance dissolve into fear? Don't miss more stories of strength, silence, and poetic justice. Subscribe and hit the bell, so you're the first to witness the next story that speaks without shouting.